That fusion of punk, rap, skateboarding, and streetwear all kind of merged into this one thing. I would say the Beastie Boys very arguably did more to create that kind of cultural mashup than anybody else. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are going to talk about the Beastie Boys, a band that has profoundly influenced both rock and rap for the last 30 years in ways that are still being felt today. From making the first rap album to hit the top of the Billboard charts, to pioneering the art of sampling, to paving the way for all the skinny white kid face tattoo rappers that started out in punk bands. That's right, the Beastie Boys walked so Ghost Main could run. So how did they do it? How did they go from being a really nasty, raw, underground hardcore band that actually has one of the very first blast beats to this, some of the most iconic, universally respected rappers at the top of best album ever lists, in the same conversation as legendary, genre-defining artists like Radiohead or Nirvana.
Jazz and A-Wall, that's our team! Step inside the party, disrupt the whole scene!
And most importantly, what exactly was their influence, impact, and legacy in both rock and rap? Well, I've got a pretty good idea, and those are the questions that I will try to answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week. Also, join my Discord if you haven't. It's up to almost 5,000 people now. It's pretty awesome. But first, I want to thank Mech Arena for sponsoring this video. Mechs are here! Mech Arena just kicked off a massive event running now until December 15th to raise $100,000 for charity by destroying 1 billion mechs in-game. As the whole community hits milestones, Mech Arena donates more funds to charity and will hand out prizes to players. From in-game loot to a whole box of limited edition Mech Arena merch shipped right to your door. And that's not all. 10 lucky players will take part in the grand finale, the Mech Arena Championship on December 16th, for a chance to pilot a real-life mech. Sounds good? Like charity? And piloting a giant mech? I mean, who doesn't? Well, here is your chance to get started. First, install the game via the link in the description of this video. It's completely free on Android and iOS. And if you use the link in the description of this video, you'll get 50,000 credits, 3 gold crates, and an exclusive Mechs Are Here event skin just for taking part. And if you want to win the big prizes, like the merch box or the opportunity to pilot a real-life mech, for that you will need to register for the event, but that is super easy too. Once you're in-game, just hit the Mechs Are Here button in your hangar and sign up. That's it. So if that sounds cool to you, start playing, go make some mayhem for a good cause. Just hit the link in the description of this video and I'll see you in the game.
We started as a punk band and we're always a punk band, and I think that we approach our rap music through a punk rock sort of background, and I think that that's what sort of set us apart.
As most of you probably know, the Beastie Boys started out back in 1981 as a hardcore band in New York City, as part of that same like grimy but really innovative Lower East Side scene centered around CBGB that created so many other legendary bands. And I think it's important to note that they weren't just some random local band that happened to be around at that time that played a couple shows here and there. They were like a legit part of that scene. In fact, their very first ever recording from 1982 is on a compilation called New York Thrash that also had bands like Bad Brains, Kraut, and the Stimulators, which was Harley Flanagan from the Cro-Mags' first band.
B-S-T-I, go B-S-T-I, that's the work we gotta be. Can you see the mercy? Can you feel the B-S-T-I?
And is one of the very first compilations put the New York hardcore scene on the map. They also played with bands like Reagan Youth, the Necros, and Urban Waste, so even though they weren't a punk band for all that long, it was really just a couple years, they were very much a part of the culture, and most importantly, the culture was also a part of them. That recording was followed by their debut EP called Wog Stew, also in 1982, which was, again, really raw, stripped down, Minor Threat style hardcore. And then in 1983, their single Cooky Puss was when they really started kind of experimenting with rap. Listening to it now, I don't know that I would call it good necessarily, but it was fun, and it was kind of a minor semi-viral hit, I guess you would say, in the New York area, and kind of ended up jump-starting their career in a weird way. They sued British Airways for using a piece of the song Beastie Revolution, which was a B-side from Cooky Puss, in a commercial without getting their permission. They got $40,000 from that, and they used that money to get an apartment and kind of sustain themselves as a band and pay the bills for a while and allow them to just kind of experiment and live without having to stress about money so much.
Smoking or non-smoking?
Cooky Puss also got them on the radar of a young producer named Rick Rubin, who obviously went on to produce like some of the most legendary, iconic rock and rap recordings of all time. But back then, he was just in the very beginning of starting his label Def Jam out of his NYU dorm room, and the Beastie Boys were one of the first artists he signed. And in fact, the first recording he did with them, their Rock Hard 12-inch single, was actually the second ever recording to list Rick Rubin as a producer. And again, listening to it now, I don't know that you would say it was the best thing they ever did, but you could see that they were already so ahead of the curve. Like using that AC/DC sample. That kind of thing may be commonplace now, but remember, this was 1984. This was a full 2 years before Run DMC and Aerosmith did Walk This Way, and mixing rap and rock like that back then was basically unheard of. But their big commercial breakthrough came in 1986 with the release of their first real full-length album, Licensed to Ill, which a lot of people may not realize was actually the first ever rap album to hit #1 on the Billboard charts. And I think there's a lot of valid conversations to be had there about how it took 3 non-threatening white kids to get that level of mainstream support for a genre that had actually been around for years at that point. But still, the fact of the matter is that they did it, and their influence on the genre was real.
When you do records like these, you're being influenced by other records. So it's like PSK and little Beastie Boys. I just started telling this story, and I just made it more graphic, you know.
I was in, I think, 4th grade in 1987, but even then, I was aware of what a just absolutely massive hit that album was. I would say they were kind of like the Limp Bizkit of their day. Fight for Your Right was kind of like the break stuff of the 80s.
You gotta fight for your right.
It was fun at the time, but honestly, it's probably not something that I would choose to listen to now, and I think the band would probably agree with me on that. But that said, with that album being such a massive hit and making so much money for everybody, that enabled them to take a lot of creative chances, which they did with their next album, Paul's Boutique, in 1989, which I would argue was their big breakthrough from a creative standpoint. I think this album was when the Beastie Boys really became the Beastie Boys. And if people were expecting more like aggro frat guy beer rap, then they must have been very, very disappointed by this album, which was really kind of like a collage of 70s funk, jazz, and rock samples with like abstract, spacey rapping over the top.
Hey, ladies in the place, I'm calling out to you. Never was a city kid, true answer was.
And although it was considered somewhat of a commercial disappointment at the time, it's now seen, I would say rightly, as maybe the ultimate example of what you could do with sampling. It has somewhere around 300 total samples on the album. Nobody actually knows exactly because they didn't keep track of all that stuff. But if you haven't listened to it before, do yourself a favor. Listen to it on headphones. It's almost like a psychedelic experience because it's just so dense and layered and rich and organic. And sampling had been around for a while. People had been doing it in rap for years, but this was before the industry really cracked down on it the way that they do now and made you negotiate and pay for every sample clearance. So they were able to just go crazy and really do whatever they wanted without having to worry about all that. Whereas now, you know, if you use just one hi-hat from one song, you got to pay somebody 50 grand for that. And the really important point here is that before Paul's Boutique, I would say sampling really wasn't considered an art form per se. It was more like a utility. It started out as something that DJs would just do for live shows. Like in the early days of rap, these were just kids from the Bronx. They didn't have instruments or a band. So they would just grab one of their parents' jazz records, find a part with a cool drum break, and then just loop that over and over on both turntables to give the MC something to rap over. And that sort of evolved into doing the same thing for recordings. Like that horn hook in I Ain't No Joke by Eric B. and Rakim is a sample from from a song called Pass the Peas by the JBs, which was a great way for those kids without access to instruments or a recording studio to still make music. But there wasn't really a lot of craft there, if that makes sense. They did it out of necessity, not because they were in love with the idea of sampling necessarily. But then Paul's Boutique came along and really opened up everybody's eyes to the full potential of sampling as really like its own art form, almost like using the sampler as an instrument. With all these ridiculously complex, super layered songs made up of dozens and dozens of obscure samples that were chopped up, processed, and recontextualized into something that nobody could say was like just a loop copied and pasted. And it's interesting that right when this happened and made everyone aware of what you could do with sampling is right about the same time that the industry cracked down on sampling, primarily in response to You Can't Touch Us by MC Hammer and Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice, I think, and really closed that door. Like, you could never make this album now unless you wanted to spend literally tens of millions of dollars on samples. And to this day, I would say it stands as a masterpiece. But in my opinion, it was their next album from 1992, Check Your Head, that I would choose as their best work. Although I will admit there's probably some personal bias here because I remember when this came out and absolutely everybody in my friend group was obsessed with this album. And just to kind of contextualize this and set the stage for it, this is when skateboarding was deeply in its tiny wheels and giant pants phase, when skate videos were 90% fisheye shots, and the soundtrack was shifting from punk to rap. The video that would have had Agent Orange on it a couple years ago now would have Far Side or Funk Dubious. And this album was just a perfect snapshot of that era of the culture. Like, putting on the video for So What You Want just instantly takes me back to buying my first New Deal deck and skating with my friends behind Safeway after school. But the really big development here from a creative standpoint is that this is when they started playing their own instruments more. Probably because now they couldn't sample the way they did before, and it was easier to just play and record the sounds that they wanted to hear rather than have to jump through the hoop of sampling them. This was and still is almost unheard of in rap, aside from a few examples like The Roots and stuff. And to me, this album was where they really brought it all together, all their influences and all their history, into something that was really uniquely theirs. Playing together as a band again, going back to their roots, but with samples, scratching, and rapping layered on top. It was this really unique, organic vibe that was authentically punk and hip-hop at the same time, which is pretty common these days, but back then was very, very rare, almost unheard of. And I think the key is that they weren't trying to present themselves as anything other than what they were. They weren't trying to be like NWA or Ice-T or whatever, which is why I think it worked and they didn't get a lot of the same criticism that people like Snow did, because they just unapologetically were who they were.
Definitely some people didn't like that, white guys were rapping, and that we felt that we were trying to take from, a community and trying to take from a music. And I feel like after our records came out, people were like, well, they're clearly doing something different with the music and not trying to be a certain thing.
This is also around the time when they started Grand Royal, which was their own magazine and then record label that was basically like the printed version of their music and the culture around it. If you think about it, it was kind of like their own social media platform, but 15 years before that was a thing.
Far more entertaining Beastie Boys news, the trio has now come out with its own magazine, and it turns out to be one of the funniest reads around. Grand Royal is, as its proprietors acknowledge, a celebration of inside humor, basketball trivia, slang, blatant opinions, and half-baked notions.
It only ran for, I think, 6 issues, but it was really fucking cool. If you Google, you can find digital versions of it out there. And if you are a Beastie Boys fan, or if you're just into 90s culture in general, I would suggest you do. They covered everything from Russell Simmons to Mudhoney to the history of Moog synths, and it really just feels like a pure labor of love, because I am 99.9% certain that they lost a lot of money on this thing. And over the next couple years, Grand Royal, the magazine, eventually kind of morphed into a record label that on Wikipedia says it was a vanity label, but I think that really kind of undersells what Grand Royal was, because they put out a lot of really great stuff from artists like Atari Teenage Riot, Jimmy Eat World, and At the Drive-In, to name just a few. So I think to call it a vanity label label really doesn't do it justice. Mike D was also one of the original business partners in a clothing brand called X Large that started up around the same time, which along with Fucked and Stussy were pretty much the brands that created the template for what you would think of as modern streetwear brands like the Hundreds and Supreme. And as far as I remember, they didn't really like overtly push X Large as something that they were a part of per se, because I think Mike wasn't really like super involved in the day-to-day of X Large. But their look and influence on fashion back then was so influential. Like if you were a skater guy in the early to mid 90s, you probably dressed like somebody in the Beastie Boys, even if you weren't even into the band. Like beanie with a flannel and maybe a vintage Ringer shirt underneath, some baggy jeans with a web belt, and either Pumas or Adidas shell toes. It was the uniform for like every alternative guy back then, and kind of still is. Like if you go look at half the bands playing This Is Hardcore, they still dress that way. So it's really hard for me to overstate how foundational this era of the Beastie Boys was for so much of what we would now think of as alternative culture. So many of the things that we take for granted now are really things that they largely helped create. That fusion of punk, rap, skateboarding, and streetwear all kind of merged into this one thing. I would say the Beastie Boys very arguably did more to create that kind of cultural mashup than anybody else. With that being said, their next album, Ill Communication, is probably their overall definitive piece of work because it took everything that they did on Check Your Head, made it a little bit more commercially accessible, and took it to #1 on Billboard, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. They had totally reinvented themselves 3 times now, from being a hardcore band to being this like frat rap group to now being, you know, whatever you want to call what they did in this era of the band, and worked their way back to the top again. And what's even more important and impressive about this to me is that their audience during this period of the band was not the same people who were listening to them back in 1987. It was a generation of kids my age, the Lollapalooza, Beavis and Butthead kind of generation, who were a little too young to be listening to Fight for Your Right when it came out. I mean, like I said, I was in 4th grade. I was not really smashing beer cans on my forehead and going to college ragers at 9 years old. And so in the same way as they reinvented their music, they'd also reinvented their audience, which is really hard to do. Sabotage became a massive mainstream hit that even normies were into. Viral obviously didn't exist back then because this was pre-internet, but if it did, the Sabotage video was the closest thing to viral in that era. And on the back of that success, I watched them become a gateway to hardcore for tons of kids at my school. They'd kind of flirted with doing rock songs before with songs like Time for Living or Looking Down the Barrel of a Gun, but this was the first time they really went all in on hardcore, and they included 2 just straight up punk songs on Ill Communication. One was called Tough Guy, the other is called Heart Attack Man. And both of them sounded like they could have been straight off that New York Thrash compilation from 1982. They also covered Screaming at a Wall by Minor Threat, and they had a hardcore side project called DFL, Dead Fucking Last, which, by the way, is a very underrated band. Check out DFL if you haven't. And keep in mind, this is all when they had a Billboard #1 album, so there were tons and tons of eyeballs on them. I remember a few of the skater kids at my high school who were primarily into the Beastie Boys rap stuff, hearing Heart Attack Man and Tough Guy and being stoked on it, and then getting into Gorilla Biscuits or some then newer bands like AFI. And I'm sure that happened all over the world. Like, how many kids got into hardcore from those 2 songs? And on the flip side of that, the same thing happened with rap. How many kids got into the Beastie Boys and then dug deeper and got into some of that classic 90s stuff like Gangstar or Mobb Deep? Again, they were selling millions and millions of albums, so if even 1% of their audience did that, that was a lot of people. Which brings us to their next album, Hello Nasty, in 1998, which I would say didn't really do anything new musically, but as far as their career, this definitely marked the transition of them into being seen as quote-unquote real music, meaning that they would get praised by the same kind of people that would write gushing articles about Radiohead or whatever, making album of the year lists and outlets like NME and Rolling Stone and Spin, which is pretty impressive considering that the critics absolutely hated them only 10 years earlier because of Fight for Your Right, which was admittedly a pretty obnoxious song. And I would say it's kind of the same story for their final 3 albums. All very good albums that were solid commercial and critical successes, but I'm gonna just mostly skip over them here for the sake of time, and because there's kind of not really that much to say about it. Like, at this point, their influence had already been felt, so really what they were doing is just building even more on the foundation that they had already created over the past 15 years. Which brings us to the final question: what is their lasting impact and legacy? What's interesting to me is that for as massively popular as they were, I mean, I think probably everybody knows who the Beastie Boys are, and probably even knows quite a few songs by them. I actually don't really hear that many people bringing up the Beastie Boys as an overt influence. Like, I can't think of a time when I heard a band list the Beastie Boys as an influence. I can't. It's weird. Especially considering how often you hear people bring up much less popular bands from that era, like, say, Typo Negative and Biohazard as influences, but you know, sometimes that's just the way it goes. But with that being said, I don't think it's a case of the Beastie Boys not being influential. I think it's kind of a little bit more complicated than that, or more nuanced. I think that they were actually so influential that almost everybody is indirectly influenced by them. They just don't necessarily realize it. Because like I said earlier, if the current version of alternative culture is defined as this sort of amorphous blend of hip hop, punk, metal, streetwear, skateboarding, and art, then I think you really have to credit the Beastie Boys as the pioneers of that with their music, with Grand Royal, with X Large, even just like the look of their music videos, not to mention all the other artists that they influenced, which went on to influence everyone else. I think they're one of those bands that almost everybody is borrowing from, whether they know it or not. So if you have never taken a deep dive into their discography, then I would say now is a very good time to change that. And of course, rest in peace to MCA. All right, my friends, that does it for this video on the strange history of the Beastie Boys. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Check me out on Twitch and Discord. There's links to both of those in the description of this video. And as always, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. It is because of your support that I'm able to do a lot of these things. Patrons get every podcast a week early. I do some Q&As and giveaways. There are members-only channels on my Discord that I'm super active in. There's also a way to have me review your music or artwork or video or anything else that you want to get my eyes or ears on. So if that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.